So for me, it was more of a learning experience than than an internal conflict, because it was like I already grew up with some, like, a very small portion of those values. So for me, it was just learning more about those things.
Pushing the boundaries.
Yes, exactly, pushing the boundaries. But in some ways, it was the parts where I did feel some conflict or challenge was questioning my own background. Because it's really easy to come to the U.S. and talk about like racism or sexism and feel like you're a liberal or a progressive person,
Right.
But to go back home and think about the same things, and then realize that you've been engaging in some of the same behaviors, and you grew up in a background where you were engaging in some of those same behaviors, is a bit of a challenge.
But what kind of behavior? Because, like, India's community is quite homogeneous, right?
Well,
in terms of race.
yeah, it's sort of like a dichotomy. So there's not as many races and ethnicities, but there's still the division of like North Indians versus South Indians, and unlike in the U.S. where there's like Northern Americans and like Southern Americans, in India it's an actual race difference. So Northern Indians are descended from the Aryans, whereas Southern Indians are descended from the Dravidians, and it's two completely different races. But no one ever talks about it because we all just automatically think of India as a homogeneous race, right?
And inside the city, was there this like hierarchy when one race is?
No, it's not a hierarchy, but it's still a split. The hierarchy comes in within Hinduism with the caste system.
Yeah. Then what kind of like racist behavior do you see yourself conducting when you go?
Well, for me, I was personally talking about more of like colorism. Like you grow up listening to everyone talking about like if you're fair-skinned you're better, and if you're dark-skinned you're not. So that same kind of ideology like was in my mind too. And then when I came to Earlham, I realized how I was feeding into the whole concept of racism just through my colorism. So that was a pretty big conflict. And then I also just even just apart from racism, since India in general is such a conservative country, there's so much more sexism than or so much more overt sexism than you find in the U.S. There's a lot of like subtle or covert sexism in the U.S., but in India it's much more overt and like much clearer.
And it's institutionalized.
Yes, it's absolutely institutionalized. Yeah, and it's socialized into everyone. So like my mom, who is a feminist, who raised me as a feminist, would still say some things that at Earlham you would realize that they're not appropriate things to say, or like they're not nice things to say. But you've been socialized to think that those things are appropriate, but these other things are not.
To some extent, are such phenomena part of the cultural heritage, rather than just because, like, if we talk about like liberalism, to some extent we are imposing the Western ideology onto those cultural structures, right?
Yeah. Well, I think liberalism has been seen as a Western ideology because the West has seemed to be more advanced. But I also know that like there's so much history even in non-Western countries of people who were liberal or leaders who were liberal, and like so. My country, India, already had like its first female president, already had our first female prime minister. So apparently it's more liberal, but the culture is still not. The culture is still rooted in the fact that even if it's a female leader of like an organization, like a CEO, she will be paid less. And then if it was a male CEO, and she will be like not respected as much. And especially the culture that I don't see as much in the U.S. is about marriage, that like a woman can, like, even the liberal feminists might believe in India that a woman can work as much as she wants to and like reach the heights of her career. But if they're not like progressive feminists, they'll still feel like at 30, if you're not married, you're not successful. And so all of that keeps featuring it. Even though like 500 years ago, we had rulers in India who were so progressive for the time. Like Akbar, who was one of the Mughal emperors of much of India. He was, in my opinion, he was one of the most secular leaders India has had. And he was a Muslim because he was one of the Mughals. But he was ruling a Hindu majority country, and he did not make anyone convert to Islam. He did not he respected all the cultural traditions of Hinduism and Islam. His one of his wives is known to be really famous because she had so much power in his kingdom, and so he was one of the most progressive rulers that I can think of India. But that was like 500 years ago, and even today, 500 years later, people seem to think that like there was no examples of progressiveness in our history in non-Western countries, but that's not true. It's just that like if the West is doing it, it's popular.
Right.
Yeah.
And if you receive those ideas from the West, you feel that you are being imposed. But actually, those ideas already
existed. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And to some extent, I just feel that like when we have, as you said, the first CEO, the first president, the first prime minister, we tend to be distracted that the problem has been solved.
Exactly. Yeah, and that's what people in the U.S. thought with Barack Obama being elected. Yeah. Oh, racism is going to end in the next 4 or 8 years. That's not going to happen. It's a step towards progress, but it's not for a solution, definitely. I know Bangladesh has a female prime minister, and she's been great for women empowerment, but that doesn't mean sexism has been solved in Bangladesh. We had our female president, her term is over. That definitely did not do anything for sexism in India. Our female prime minister in the 80s, I want to say? Yeah, in the 1980s. She was a brilliant person, and I think she did a lot to show back in the 80s to India that like women can be leaders and can be powerful and do good work. But that doesn't mean that there's still not that mentality that if she hadn't been married, she wouldn't have been successful in people's opinions.
But to some extent, I'm just trying to think from an individual's perspective, like an individual living in this kind of structure. To some extent, you think that this idea of equality is interesting. But for a housewife, for example, this idea does not have that much to do with your life. Somehow the idea of the women being lower than the men have been part of a very practical structure, whether women can actually benefit from having a breadwinner in their family, right? Then if we talk about all this ideology, it's also important to pay attention to, for example, the economic reality in India, the opportunities people are given. So, from your personal story, when was the time, even though you were born in India and into this structure, when was the time that you saw that this problem of inequality became a personal concern for you? Because I can see passion in the way you share about this.
I think that part of the many inequalities in the world that exist, that particular part that relates to sex and gender inequality, was, I could see from very early on in my own family, because my mom's sister, my aunt, has a job. She works as a teacher at a school. She earns more than her husband does. She learned how to drive. She bought her own car with her own money. Her husband doesn't know how to drive. She drives the whole family around, and they are pretty conservative. But that doesn't mean that her husband didn't realize that if she was the breadwinner for the family, that was a bad thing, right? And her husband is totally okay with it, but no one else is. Everyone else, their neighbors, they all want to get all up in their business and be like, how are you okay with your wife earning more than you? And I'm like, that's none of your concern, first of all, and secondly, it doesn't matter as long as they're okay with this system. And on the other hand, my mom left her job when I was born, so she has been a homemaker ever since. And even though she doesn't need financial or even though my father earns enough for our family, financial independence would be great for her, because because otherwise the system, even though, and I'm not saying all people should feel like this, but from my perspective, if you're a homemaker in a family, you can be satisfied, and that's great for you, and that's amazing. And you definitely have the choice to do that. But in cultures like India that are generally conservative, someone in that situation automatically gets seen as inferior, automatically has less power. And so power gets tied with how much you earn, what your position is, how many people report to you. And so homemakers and housewives automatically lose power. So I'm totally fine with you being a homemaker and a housewife if you're happy with it and if you have equal power in the relationship.
Right. But also in your interpretation of this, I think another way we can frame this, not only as a conservative liberal dichotomy, but also as a collective or individualist culture. Because the case when I can be a housewife and I feel totally fine with my situation, not worrying about the social judgment, should only happen in a very individualist society like US, where people, right? But India is characteristically, if I understand it right, a very collective culture. Then do you believe that moving towards more equality or more egalitarian society will involve shaking the basic tenets of the culture, no longer collectiveness, more towards individualism, more towards capitalism and all those things?